The sun had just begun its slow ascent over the vast horizon, painting the Nile Valley in shades of gold and amber. Mist curled over the river's surface, hiding the stirrings of life that were about to awaken. For most of us, 7,000 years feels like an eternity, a time so distant it is almost unimaginable. Yet, for the people who lived along these banks, every sunrise was a battle against uncertainty, a fragile promise that life would continue for another day. The Nile was both a giver and a taker. Its waters nourished the soil, allowing crops to flourish, yet its floods could sweep away entire villages in moments, leaving nothing but mud, debris, and despair. For the earliest Egyptians, survival was never guaranteed, it was a daily negotiation with forces far beyond their control. Imagine walking barefoot on the cool, damp earth of a village just as the first sounds of the day pierce the air, the lowing of cattle, the distant cries of children, the rhythmic clanging of early tools shaping wood and clay. Families huddled in simple homes made of sun-baked mud bricks, their walls absorbing the heat of the day only to release it slowly through the night. Smoke from small fires mingled with the scent of freshly tilled soil, and the aroma of bread baking over embers drifted through narrow alleys. Life was simple, but precarious. Illness, hunger, predators, and human conflict were never far away. A single misstep, a single misfortune, could unravel the delicate balance that sustained the village. The earliest Egyptians were not strangers to fear. They understood that their world was a web of unseen dangers. A sudden storm could swell the Nile, turning its familiar waters into a wall of destruction. Crocodiles waded silently in the river, their yellow eyes gleaming just beneath the surface, ready to strike. Wolves and jackals prowled the surrounding desert at night, hunting the weak and unwary. Every decision mattered, every step could mean safety or death. And yet, amidst this constant tension, there was a rhythm to life, a fragile harmony born from generations of adaptation. People learned to read the river, predict its moods, and move in sync with its patterns. They developed skills and rituals that allowed them to survive where others might have perished. It was a world of extremes. Joy and terror coexisted in a single day, the birth of a child celebrated with exuberant laughter, while the sudden illness of an elder could plunge an entire family into fear and despair. Stories were told of ancestors who had survived floods, droughts, and raids, and these stories became more than memory, they were instruction manuals, guiding the living through dangers that could not always be seen. Even in their simplest acts, baking bread, weaving baskets, tending goats, there was a quiet heroism, a testament to human resilience against a world that demanded constant vigilance. And yet, for all their skill and foresight, the Egyptians of this time were often at the mercy of forces they could not fully understand or control. What the river would do next was always a question. Which crops would survive the scorching sun? Which children would grow strong enough to endure the harsh realities of life? These questions hung over the valley like an invisible shadow, shaping decisions and forging a culture defined by both wonder and unease. By witnessing their world, we begin to understand not just their survival, but the courage it took to greet each day without knowing what it might bring. Life along the Nile 7,000 years ago was both ordinary and extraordinary. It was ordinary in its routines, its chores, its daily negotiations with hunger and fatigue. It was extraordinary in its fragility, in the constant tension between existence and oblivion. As we peer into this ancient world, one question lingers: in such a precarious environment, how did humanity endure, innovate, and build the foundations of a civilization that would echo through millennia? The answer is not simple. And the story is only beginning. The morning sun bathed the Nile Valley in a soft, golden glow as families began their day. Villages stirred to life in a quiet, purposeful rhythm, each household performing rituals honed over generations. Children ran barefoot across the uneven mud paths, laughing despite the ever-present threat of the river's unpredictable floods. Women carried water in clay jars, balancing them on their heads with a practiced grace, while men prepared their tools for the labor that awaited in the fields. Life was simple, yet every motion was a calculated act of survival. Each day was a delicate choreography, a balance between routine and unpredictability. Inside the modest homes, the scent of baking bread mixed with the earthy aroma of the Nile mud walls. Families gathered around small clay hearths, sharing the humble meals that would sustain them. Grains had to be carefully stored and rationed, a sudden scarcity could spell disaster. Parents taught children the importance of every morsel, of every drop of water, embedding lessons of prudence and vigilance in their young minds. These lessons were not abstract, they were lessons of life and death, of how a single mistake or misjudgment could unravel the fragile threads of existence. Work began in earnest along the riverbanks. Men and women alike took to the fields, guided by the ancient patterns of planting and harvesting. The Nile's waters had to be managed with care, irrigation channels were dug, reinforced, and repaired with tireless effort. Each furrow in the soil was a promise of survival, each seed a gamble against nature's unpredictability. Labor was grueling and unforgiving, yet the community moved in unison, a living testament to human endurance. Every family depended on the other, and any lapse could have consequences that rippled across the entire village. The stakes were never low, and cooperation was the only way to withstand the uncertainties of this world. Children were not spared from the responsibilities of survival. From an early age, they were taught to carry, to fetch, to observe, and to mimic the skills of their elders. Play was interwoven with lessons in caution, a game along the river's edge could teach balance, an errand to the marketplace could teach vigilance. They learned the subtle signs of danger, the darkening clouds of a storm, the distant movements of wild animals, the tone in a neighbor's voice signaling unrest. Their innocence was a fragile shield, constantly tested by the harsh realities of their environment. But life was not only labor. Community gatherings offered rare moments of respite and connection. In the shade of date palms or around communal fires, stories were shared, often filled with lessons and warnings. Elders recounted events of floods that had devastated the lands, of children lost to disease, and of strangers who had arrived on the river with uncertain intentions. Each tale was more than entertainment, it was a coded guide, a repository of collective memory designed to ensure survival in a world that offered no guarantees. These stories were imbued with suspense, the unknown lurking at every corner, reminding listeners that life was a fragile treasure. Even within the home, tension simmered beneath the surface. Scarcity bred disputes, and survival demanded hard decisions. Should the family consume the last of the stored grain, or ration it for the weak and elderly? Could they trust neighbors, or were alliances fragile, liable to collapse under pressure? These questions were never theoretical, they dictated life or death. Every interaction, every choice, carried weight. And yet, within these struggles, bonds of loyalty and affection were forged. The very need to survive together created a depth of human connection that was as profound as it was precarious. As the day wore on, the heat of the sun intensified, turning the mud paths into a mosaic of shadows and light. The river glistened deceptively calm, hiding beneath its placid surface the dangers that could strike without warning. Work in the fields continued, children returned from errands, and elders moved slowly, their bodies marked by decades of labor and the weight of experience. The village existed in a constant dance with chance, a delicate equilibrium where any misstep could have consequences that echoed far beyond a single household. Yet, for all the challenges, there were moments of quiet triumph. The successful harvest, the laughter of children, the shared joy of a well-cooked meal, these were victories against a world that demanded constant vigilance. The human spirit, fragile yet resilient, asserted itself in these small victories. But as dusk approached and the Nile's waters reflected the fiery streaks of the setting sun, an uneasy tension settled over the village. The day's labor was done, but night brought new uncertainties. Predators prowled, illness could strike unseen, and rival communities might encroach upon their fragile haven. Even in these final moments of light, the weight of survival lingered. Life along the Nile was a tapestry woven from both joy and terror, hope and fear. Every household was connected, every action consequential, every story a lesson in endurance. And yet, the deeper question remained, a quiet suspense that would follow them into the night. In a world so fragile, so precarious, how long could any one person, or family, truly endure? The answer, as always, remained hidden, waiting for the next day to reveal its truths. The Nile's life-giving waters were both a blessing and a constant source of tension. For the earliest Egyptians, agriculture was not merely a vocation, it was the fulcrum upon which their very existence balanced. The river's annual floods dictated the rhythm of life, bringing fertile silt that could make the soil teem with promise, yet also carrying the latent threat of devastation. Villagers watched the water levels with a mixture of reverence and dread, knowing that a single miscalculation or a sudden storm could wipe out an entire season's labor in hours. In such a world, the stakes of survival were immediate, tangible, and relentless. Fields stretched along the riverbanks in neat, painstakingly dug plots, each one the product of countless hours of labor. Farmers, their muscles honed by years of toil, bent over the earth with primitive but effective tools, wooden plows, sharpened sticks, and stone sickles. The act of planting was more than a simple gesture, it was a gamble with nature itself. Seeds were sown with care, each one representing hope, desperation, and an unspoken prayer to the gods above. Failure was not an option, for the consequences were literal and dire: hunger, illness, and the slow erosion of community trust. Irrigation demanded equal attention. Channels were dug by hand, trenches carefully aligned to distribute water evenly across the fields. Water had to be diverted, measured, and maintained with precision. Too little, and crops would wither under the sun's merciless glare. Too much, and roots would rot, drowning the very sustenance they sought to nurture. This delicate balance required constant vigilance, a harmony with the natural world that few modern humans could fully appreciate. Villagers developed an almost instinctual understanding of the river's moods, reading the color of its waters, the height of its banks, and the direction of its flow. Each observation could mean the difference between feast and famine. Yet, even the most careful plans were subject to forces beyond human control. Sudden storms could swell the Nile overnight, flooding homes and sweeping away the hard work of months. Crops could fall prey to swarms of locusts or invasive pests, leaving fields barren and bellies empty. Families huddled in fear during these events, whispering prayers to gods they hoped would intervene. The precariousness of survival was never more apparent than in these moments, when life and death seemed to hang by the thinnest of threads. Within this high-stakes environment, ingenuity became a form of resistance. Ancient Egyptians experimented with early crop rotation, selective planting, and ingenious water management techniques that allowed them to coax productivity from unforgiving land. They domesticated animals not just for food, but also to plow fields and provide manure to enrich the soil. Children learned to identify fertile patches, adults shared knowledge across households, and entire communities relied on a delicate network of cooperation. The survival of one family was tied to the vigilance and skill of its neighbors. In this way, agriculture was not merely a physical act, it was a social glue, binding people together in a shared struggle against the ever-present threats of nature. Even as villagers toiled, there were moments of suspense and fear. A sudden shout could indicate a crop being stolen, a predator approaching, or a flood breaking through the carefully constructed embankments. Every sound, every movement, carried weight. The river's seemingly gentle current could betray its lethality, and every day brought a new set of unknown variables. Families learned to read subtle signs, the behavior of birds, the smell of wet soil, the darkening of clouds over the distant desert. Survival was an intricate dance of observation, preparation, and courage, requiring constant attention and quick thinking. Despite these dangers, the rewards of successful harvests were profound. Flourishing fields meant not just food, but security, status, and the ability to invest in tools, homes, and even cultural practices like art and ritual. Festivals and communal gatherings celebrated the bounty, offering temporary relief from the relentless tension that defined daily life. Yet these moments of joy were always tinged with awareness that tomorrow could bring disaster. The very unpredictability of the river and the land created a slow-burn suspense that permeated every aspect of existence. Families passed down survival strategies from one generation to the next. A child who witnessed a flood or a failed crop learned lessons that could save lives decades later. Stories of past calamities, fields washed away, livestock lost, neighbors starving, were shared not only as cautionary tales but as blueprints for resilience. Human ingenuity, collective memory, and observation became as essential to survival as the soil itself. The Egyptians understood that the natural world was neither enemy nor ally, it was a force to be respected, studied, and, when possible, tamed. Yet even with all their skill, the threat of failure never fully disappeared. One unseasonal storm, one swarm of locusts, one misjudged irrigation channel could undo months of labor, leaving entire families exposed to hunger, disease, and social instability. The suspense of survival was constant, an unrelenting undercurrent in every action and decision. Villagers lived with a quiet tension, knowing that life could change irrevocably with a single misstep. And within this tension, human courage and adaptability shone most vividly, as ordinary people performed extraordinary feats of foresight, endurance, and cooperation in a world that offered no guarantees. By the time the sun began its descent, casting long shadows over the Nile, families would gather to assess their day's labor. Successes were celebrated quietly, failures mourned, and preparations for tomorrow began even before night fell. Life along the river was a continuous cycle of effort, observation, and hope, an endless negotiation with both chance and necessity. In this world, agriculture was far more than survival, it was the crucible in which human ingenuity, patience, and courage were forged, a testament to the resilience that would allow these early Egyptians not merely to exist, but to lay the foundations of a civilization that would endure for millennia. And yet, as the shadows of evening deepened, the lingering question remained, could even the most careful planning, the sharpest observation, and the strongest community protect them from the caprices of nature, or was each harvest merely a temporary reprieve from the inexorable tests of survival? The answer, like the river itself, was unpredictable, flowing forward into uncertainty and suspense, carrying with it the hopes and fears of all who depended on its waters. The scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the earthy aroma of the Nile, curling through the small homes of early Egyptian villages. For families who had toiled from dawn to dusk in the fields, food was far more than sustenance, it was survival, a tangible measure of their skill, luck, and resilience. Bread was the cornerstone of their diet, coarse and dense, made from emmer wheat or barley, baked in small clay ovens. Yet even this staple carried a silent tension. A single poor harvest, a poorly stored batch, or an infestation of pests could turn the most basic meal into a scarce luxury, leaving hunger and weakness in its wake. Fish, caught from the river or trapped in its shallow channels, offered protein but also introduced new uncertainties. Each catch was a gamble, some days, the nets returned heavy with bounty, other days, empty or filled with spoiled fish. The Nile, though a lifeline, was capricious, its depths hiding dangers that could snatch away food, life, or hope. Children watched their fathers haul in the nets, wide-eyed with excitement, never fully understanding the precarious balance that allowed a family to eat today and worry about tomorrow. Every meal was earned, and every morsel was precious. Vegetables and legumes added variety, but they too were at the mercy of the land and the river. Lentils, onions, garlic, and leeks grew in carefully tended plots, yet even the hardiest crops could fail. A sudden pest infestation, a creeping mold, or an unexpected drought could wipe out months of preparation in days. Villagers quickly learned to ration, to store wisely, and to improvise meals from whatever remained. In this environment, scarcity was not theoretical, it was an ever-present force, shaping behavior, hierarchy, and even survival strategies. Families that failed to manage food wisely risked not only malnutrition but social tension and, in extreme cases, death. Food preparation itself demanded skill and vigilance. Grain had to be ground into flour, mixed with water, and carefully kneaded to create dough that could rise and bake over open flames. The smallest misstep could ruin the batch, turning the family's efforts into wasted labor and heightened anxiety. Preservation techniques, drying fish, salting meat, and storing bread in cool, dry spaces, were vital. Each practice carried its own risk, from mold that could silently make people sick to spoiled provisions that could lead to conflict over the limited edible stores. Eating was never mindless, it was a careful negotiation with scarcity, a lesson taught from generation to generation. Even the act of consuming food carried tension. Families were acutely aware of the seasonal fluctuations that dictated abundance and deprivation. During the fertile months following the river's inundation, meals were generous, and spirits were lifted. Yet in lean seasons, children went to bed hungry, and parents wrestled with impossible decisions: who would receive what portion, and who might have to go without. Such choices, though hidden from modern eyes, left deep emotional imprints. Hunger was not merely a physical sensation, it was a source of stress, fear, and social friction, quietly shaping human behavior and relationships. Communal meals and shared labor offered temporary relief from this tension. Villagers sometimes came together to process grain, bake bread, or cook larger quantities of food. These gatherings were more than practicality, they were moments of unity, a reminder that survival was not only an individual endeavor but a collective one. Yet even in these moments of camaraderie, underlying uncertainty persisted. The specter of the next failed crop, the next mismanaged resource, or the next illness always lingered in the background, a silent reminder that abundance could vanish overnight. Drink, too, carried its own story. Water from the Nile was filtered through clay vessels or left to settle, yet it could harbor invisible threats, parasites, bacteria, and other dangers that could quietly undermine health. Beer, brewed from fermented grains, served both as sustenance and safer hydration, but its preparation required precise timing and careful attention. Too little fermentation, and it spoiled; too long, and it became unpalatable. For the Egyptians, even something as seemingly simple as quenching thirst was fraught with tension, a daily reminder of the delicate balance between survival and suffering. The consequences of failure were stark. Malnutrition weakened bodies, made children more susceptible to disease, and left the elderly vulnerable to minor infections that could become fatal. Hunger could fuel desperation, leading to disputes, theft, or social unrest. At the same time, success brought relief, even fleeting joy. A well-cooked meal, a bountiful harvest, or a rare catch of fish created a sense of accomplishment, a temporary victory against the relentless uncertainty of life along the Nile. These small triumphs were celebrated quietly, often with gratitude, ritual, or shared stories that reinforced bonds and transmitted practical wisdom. Food was deeply intertwined with human emotion, social dynamics, and cultural practices. Each meal reflected not only survival but ingenuity, observation, and cooperation. The Egyptians understood the intricate relationship between diet and endurance. They learned that certain foods strengthened the body, that combinations could prevent deficiency, and that preservation and rationing were crucial for long-term survival. Eating was therefore both a practical necessity and a symbolic act, a tangible measure of resilience in a world where every day demanded vigilance, skill, and courage. And yet, no matter how well they planned or prepared, uncertainty lingered. A single missed crop, a spoiled batch of food, or an unexpected shortage could unravel the hard-won balance of daily life. The Egyptians of this era lived with the quiet suspense of knowing that sustenance, though seemingly simple, was never guaranteed. Every meal was a triumph, every bite a victory over nature, chance, and circumstance. And as night fell, the family gathered around flickering fires, nourishing both body and spirit, aware that tomorrow would once again test their ingenuity, resilience, and endurance in ways that were both ordinary and extraordinary. The sun had barely climbed above the horizon when the village stirred with purpose, the quiet before the day's labor crackling with tension. Work was the heartbeat of survival, and in the Nile Valley, it was also the stage where social hierarchy revealed itself in stark, unyielding terms. From the lowliest farmer bending over parched soil to the elite scribes recording accounts and decrees, every individual understood their place in a delicate web of interdependence. Yet beneath the apparent order lay a simmering tension: who labored, who prospered, and who held the power to dictate the lives of others. In this world, work was both a necessity and a measure of identity, and every action carried consequence. The farmers were the backbone of society, their hands calloused, their backs bowed from long hours in the fields. Their lives were defined by the rhythms of planting, irrigation, and harvesting, but even in their labor, danger loomed. A poorly constructed canal could ruin the crops of an entire village. A misjudged flood could sweep away months of toil in hours. Each day demanded vigilance, skill, and endurance. Yet despite the burdens, farmers carried a quiet pride. Their work sustained families, fed communities, and laid the foundation for a civilization that would endure for millennia. Still, beneath their pride simmered frustration. The fruits of their labor enriched others, scribes, officials, and priests, who wielded influence without ever soiling their hands. Builders, carpenters, and artisans worked alongside the farmers but faced a different set of pressures. Construction of homes, communal granaries, and early monuments required precision and cooperation. One misaligned stone, one poorly executed joint could compromise entire structures, leading to injury or the waste of precious resources. For the laborers, work was never merely physical, it was a constant negotiation with risk and expectation. Success brought respect, but failure could mean not just disgrace but real danger. Accidents were common, and in a society where survival hung by a fragile thread, even minor setbacks carried severe consequences. Above them, scribes and overseers monitored output, recording grain yields, labor contributions, and community obligations. Their knowledge was power, granting them authority over life and death, scarcity and abundance. Their meticulous records were not merely administrative, they dictated who received rations, who was conscripted for special projects, and who faced penalties for underperformance. For ordinary villagers, the scribe's words could alter destinies, heightening the stakes of daily labor. Suspense and tension ran silently through the air, one misreported crop, one overlooked detail, and a family could find itself deprived, vulnerable, and exposed to both natural and social dangers. Hierarchy was everywhere, and it carried its own hidden threats. The elite, priests, and officials relied on the labor of others for their comfort, yet their decisions could spark conflict. Favoritism, disputes over resources, and jealousy simmered beneath the surface, ready to erupt. Villagers understood that survival required not just skill in agriculture or construction but diplomacy, tact, and careful observation. Every interaction was charged, every gesture potentially consequential. A heated word with a neighbor could escalate into a rift that jeopardized mutual cooperation, while loyalty to the wrong overseer could invite punishment or social ostracism. The social web was as intricate and demanding as the irrigation channels crisscrossing the fields. Even children and adolescents were drawn into this web of labor and hierarchy. From an early age, they learned the value of obedience, the need for precision, and the rewards and dangers of social positioning. Tasks that seemed mundane, carrying water, tending animals, weaving mats, were lessons in responsibility and consequence. Children absorbed tension alongside instruction, understanding that their future depended not only on skill but on their ability to navigate social structures. Mistakes were instructive but never without risk, reinforcing a subtle, ever-present suspense that shaped their perception of the world. Amid the relentless demands of survival, moments of camaraderie and mutual support offered temporary respite. Workers shared meals, exchanged stories, and celebrated small victories, an especially good harvest, the successful construction of a granary, or the safe return of a hunting party. These moments reinforced the community's cohesion, offering both physical sustenance and emotional relief. Yet they were fragile, shadowed by the persistent awareness that disaster, natural or human, could strike at any moment. The rhythm of life was punctuated by suspense, a slow-burning tension that underscored the precariousness of existence. Conflicts and disputes were inevitable, for scarcity magnified every slight and mistake. A missing tool, a damaged field, or a misallocated ration could ignite anger, resentment, and sometimes violence. Villagers had to navigate not only the demands of the natural world but also the complexities of human ambition and emotion. Punishment for failure or defiance could be severe, whether through physical reprimand, social shaming, or loss of access to vital resources. This ever-present tension infused daily labor with a sense of unpredictability. Even those who seemed secure were never truly free from the pressures that defined the social hierarchy. And yet, within this rigid structure, ingenuity and resilience thrived. Farmers developed irrigation techniques that maximized yield, builders devised new methods for construction, and children learned strategies to survive within a system that could be both nurturing and unforgiving. Each person's contribution was vital, and success required cooperation, foresight, and adaptability. In this delicate balance, human courage, endurance, and subtle negotiation of power created a dynamic interplay of tension and triumph. Every day was a test, every achievement a victory against forces both visible and unseen. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, shadows lengthened across the village, and the day's labor concluded. The exhausted bodies of workers returned home, while scribes completed their records and officials reflected on the distribution of resources. In the quiet moments of evening, the social hierarchy became palpable, its tensions softened but not erased. Tomorrow would demand the same relentless effort, the same careful observation of both nature and neighbor, and the same courage to endure. The cycle of work, labor, and social negotiation was unending, a crucible that shaped not only survival but the very character of the early Egyptians. And yet, lurking beneath the apparent order, the questions persisted: who would falter under the weight of expectation, and who would rise above it? Could the balance of power, labor, and cooperation hold in the face of disaster, or would a single mistake unravel the delicate tapestry of survival? In this world, work was far more than a means of sustenance. It was a stage where human resilience, ambition, fear, and ingenuity collided, producing a slow-burning suspense that carried through every household, every field, and every heartbeat along the Nile. Life along the Nile was never without peril, and one of the most insidious threats came not from storms or predators, but from within the human body itself. Disease, injury, and mortality hovered constantly over every household, a shadow that no amount of labor, ingenuity, or planning could fully dispel. The earliest Egyptians lived in a fragile equilibrium, where the line between health and sickness was thin and often invisible. A minor infection could become fatal, a small injury could fester, and the simplest illness could claim a life that yesterday had been strong and full of promise. The fragility of life was a constant presence, a slow-burning tension that threaded through every act of daily existence. Medical knowledge was rudimentary, yet the Egyptians displayed remarkable ingenuity. Herbs, poultices, and rituals formed the backbone of early medicine, a blend of observation, superstition, and trial-and-error experimentation. A healer might wrap a wound in linen, apply crushed herbs, or recite incantations intended to invoke divine protection. Success was inconsistent, and often illusory. Families watched anxiously, praying that a treatment would work, knowing that failure could mean death. Fear and hope coexisted in every household, creating a palpable suspense that could escalate at a moment's notice. Children were especially vulnerable. Fever, diarrhea, and infections took a heavy toll on the youngest members of the community. Parents learned to read subtle signs: a child's unusual lethargy, a sudden pallor, or the faintest cough could indicate a life-threatening condition. Every symptom was a potential alarm, a signal that immediate attention was required. Yet even with vigilance, outcomes were uncertain. The natural world, pathogens invisible to the eye, and the limits of human knowledge combined to create a silent, omnipresent threat that could strike at any time. The elderly and infirm faced equally grave dangers. Arthritis, dental decay, and age-related weakness made daily life arduous. Simple tasks, such as carrying water or tending animals, could result in injury. Even minor wounds were risky, for infections were rampant and antibiotics unknown. Families had to make difficult choices: whom to protect, whom to tend first, and how to ration precious resources when multiple members were in need. These decisions carried profound emotional weight, heightening both suspense and empathy, as viewers recognized the human vulnerability underlying every choice. Epidemics, though less understood, struck without warning. A sudden outbreak could sweep through a village with terrifying speed, leaving families powerless to respond. The symptoms were mysterious, the transmission unclear, and the treatments largely ineffective. Communities were forced to watch helplessly as sickness claimed lives, the tension mounting with every passing hour. These events reinforced the ever-present fragility of human life, the reality that despite ingenuity, courage, and careful planning, survival was never guaranteed. Injuries, too, carried their own suspense. Labor in the fields, construction of homes, or handling of livestock could easily result in cuts, broken bones, or worse. Without proper care, these injuries could become fatal. Villagers improvised with splints made from reeds, bandages from linen, and poultices of herbs, but the margin for error was slim. The risk of infection, combined with limited knowledge of anatomy and hygiene, meant that even routine accidents were fraught with danger. Every step outside the home, every task completed, was imbued with tension, an implicit acknowledgement of the stakes. Religion and superstition intersected with medicine, adding another layer of psychological tension. Families often turned to gods and rituals for protection, seeking favor or intervention when natural remedies failed. Amulets, charms, and prayers were integrated into treatments, creating a fragile hope that divine forces might compensate for human limitations. Yet this reliance on the unseen brought its own uncertainty. Did the ritual work, or was the patient merely resilient? Was a sudden recovery a miracle, or a coincidence? The suspense of the unknown lingered in every household, threading fear and hope together inextricably. Despite these ever-present dangers, the Egyptians demonstrated resilience. Knowledge was passed down through generations, careful observation became second nature, and communities developed informal systems of care. Families shared remedies, warned one another of contagions, and adapted daily routines to minimize risk. Yet even these precautions could not eliminate the tension. Each day remained a delicate negotiation between human effort and forces beyond comprehension or control. Life, for all its routine and structure, was perpetually on the edge. The emotional weight of disease and mortality permeated family life. Every loss was both private and communal, every recovery a small, hard-earned victory. Children absorbed the lessons of vulnerability and resilience simultaneously, learning that courage and caution were inseparable. Adults carried the anxiety of what could go wrong, yet pressed forward with labor, preparation, and care, determined to protect those most vulnerable. The suspense was constant, unspoken but ever-present, shaping not only individual behavior but the collective culture of survival along the Nile. And as night fell, the village settled into uneasy rest. Fires flickered against the walls of mud brick homes, and the survivors reflected on the day's events, the minor injuries treated, the herbs applied, the sick watched over, and the healthy nurtured. Tomorrow would bring new labor, new uncertainties, and new encounters with illness and injury. The fragility of life remained a persistent undercurrent, a silent suspense that defined existence. For the early Egyptians, survival was a daily tightrope walk, where courage, ingenuity, and hope collided with fear, vulnerability, and mortality. Every heartbeat was both a triumph and a reminder that life, however fleeting, was precious and tenuous in equal measure. Life in ancient Egypt was as beautiful as it was brutal, and nowhere was this more evident than in the fragile, precarious balance between health and disease. For ordinary people living 7,000 years ago, the body itself could become a battlefield. The Nile, which nourished them, also carried invisible enemies, parasites, bacteria, and the constant threat of waterborne illnesses. A simple cut from a stone tool, or a minor fever, could spiral into a deadly situation if left untreated. Every day was a gamble, a silent duel with the unseen forces that governed life. In the heart of a small riverside settlement, a young mother named Aset rose before dawn. Her children slept in reed mats beside the mud brick walls of their home, their faces peaceful yet vulnerable. She had spent the last night tending to her youngest, a boy whose fever refused to break. In her hands, she held a crude bundle of medicinal herbs, plucked from the riverbank. These plants, passed down through generations, carried the faint hope of relief. Yet she knew that hope alone could not guarantee survival. Ancient Egyptian medicine was part ritual, part observation, and entirely a product of trial and error. Healing was never certain. Aset's husband, Kem, returned from the fields just as the sun's first rays glimmered on the Nile. His face was etched with worry. The crops had been failing, and the family's provisions were dwindling. Food scarcity weakened the immune system, making every cough, every rash, every fever, even more dangerous. Aset whispered to him about the children's condition, her voice barely audible over the distant cries of birds and the river's gentle murmur. They both understood that a single misstep could cost one of their children's lives. The tension in their small home was palpable, a quiet fear that clung to the air like morning mist. Across the village, other families faced similar struggles. Children wheezed under blankets too thin to ward off the Nile's morning chill. Farmers returned with bloody hands from minor injuries that festered into infections. The village healer, an elderly man whose knowledge of herbs and rituals was unparalleled, moved from hut to hut, trying to stave off death. He whispered prayers and incantations, laid hands upon the sick, and brewed potions whose effectiveness was sometimes miraculous and sometimes tragically insufficient. His tools were simple: stones for grinding herbs, clay pots for boiling water, and his own intimate knowledge of human anatomy, derived from observation over decades. Yet even his wisdom could not conquer the invisible enemies lurking in the mud, in the water, and in the very air the villagers breathed. The impact of illness extended far beyond the immediate suffering. When a parent fell ill, the family's survival was threatened, the fields went untended, the animals unfed, and the fragile stores of grain became vulnerable. Epidemics could sweep through entire communities, leaving devastation in their wake. Archaeological evidence tells us of bones with lesions from untreated infections, skeletons showing malnutrition alongside signs of parasitic invasion. These were not isolated tragedies, they were part of a relentless struggle that defined daily life. Every family lived in the shadow of mortality, every individual aware that death could come suddenly, silently, or slowly over weeks of suffering. For Aset, the danger was personal. Her youngest child's fever climbed with the sun, burning through the thin fabric of his body like wildfire. She sprinkled ground herbs into warm water and administered them with trembling hands, murmuring prayers she had learned from her mother. Each moment was a battle against time itself. She had seen neighbors lose children to conditions that modern medicine would treat in a matter of days: diarrhea, infections, parasitic infestations, even measles-like illnesses. In this world, medicine was as much about hope as it was about healing, a fragile bridge between life and death. Food scarcity amplified these dangers. The river had been generous the previous season, but an unusually harsh flood had destroyed some crops and rotted stored grains. Villagers scavenged for edible roots, fish, and the occasional wild fowl, their diets meager and inconsistent. Malnutrition left them vulnerable to disease, their bodies unable to mount the defenses that could save them from infections. Even those who appeared strong were at risk, for a single misstep, a spoiled meal, a contaminated water source, could unleash a cascade of illness. Survival demanded constant vigilance, ingenuity, and a measure of luck. Beyond the physical threats, psychological strain weighed heavily. Fear, grief, and helplessness became companions, threading through daily life. Aset often whispered to herself, a protective ritual to ward off despair, while she watched over her children. She imagined the worst-case scenarios, rehearsing responses to fevers, rashes, and sudden weakness. Villagers would come together, sharing knowledge, herbs, and support, forming fragile networks of resilience. Yet even in the midst of community, isolation and dread could creep in, particularly for those who faced repeated losses. Even the elderly were not spared. Those who had once toiled alongside the farmers and fishermen were increasingly fragile, their bones brittle, their immune systems compromised. Many relied on the generosity of younger relatives, who themselves balanced work, survival, and care. The cycle of vulnerability was relentless. Death was a constant, unwelcome visitor, claiming those young and old alike with seeming indifference. The Nile nurtured, but it also reminded them of the fragility of life. Aset's story reaches a crescendo one evening as her child's condition worsens. The sun dips low, casting long shadows across the village. The healer arrives with hastened steps, his expression grave. The herbs may help, he says, but the fever is stubborn, and complications may arise. Every breath the child takes is measured, weighted with tension. Aset's hands tremble as she cradles him, and the viewer feels the unbearable suspense, the intimate, gut-wrenching reality of life and death 7,000 years ago. The scene fades with the soft murmur of the river, the uncertain outcome lingering like a shadow over the village. In the world of the ancient Egyptians, survival was never guaranteed. Illness could strike without warning, and death was an ever-present companion. But within this struggle, resilience, ingenuity, and love flourished. Families like Aset's adapted, improvised, and endured, creating a legacy of human perseverance that echoes through millennia. The shadows of their struggles remain buried beneath the sands, silent reminders of a world where every heartbeat was a triumph, and every dawn a small miracle. Even amidst the relentless challenges of survival, the ingenuity of ancient Egyptians shone like a beacon against the darkness of uncertainty. Life along the Nile demanded more than endurance, it required constant adaptation, invention, and creativity. From the way they harvested grain to the tools they crafted, every innovation was a lifeline. The river itself, while a source of life, was unpredictable, its floods could drown crops or deposit fertile silt. Humans had to respond not just with brute strength, but with intelligence, curiosity, and the courage to experiment. In a small village, a craftsman named Mary devoted his life to solving problems that others accepted as inevitable. His hands were calloused, his brow perpetually furrowed with concentration, but his eyes held a spark of relentless curiosity. He began each day surveying the fields, observing the patterns of water, noting the shifts in the wind, and listening to the murmurs of the river. He experimented with rudimentary irrigation techniques, constructing channels from clay and reeds to guide water more efficiently to parched plots. It was meticulous, painstaking work, and yet, each adjustment could spell the difference between famine and feast. Mary was not alone in his efforts. Women in the village were equally inventive, finding ways to stretch limited resources and create tools from the simplest materials. Aset, the mother whose family had battled illness and scarcity, discovered that by mixing crushed stones with clay, she could harden the walls of her home against rain and river surges. Villagers shared knowledge in hushed tones, swapping techniques for weaving mats, crafting fishing nets, or preserving grains. These innovations were often born of desperation, but they revealed a striking capacity for adaptation. Each discovery, no matter how small, carried profound consequences for survival. Food preparation itself became an arena for creativity. Ancient Egyptians transformed the limited resources at hand into meals that were not just sustenance but a demonstration of skill and knowledge. Fish were smoked or sun-dried, grains ground into coarse flour and mixed with wild herbs, and bread was carefully baked in makeshift ovens. These culinary innovations were guided by observation, trial, and error, and each method reflected a deep understanding of the natural world. Families learned to anticipate the subtle changes in climate, water levels, and animal behavior, adjusting their techniques to ensure survival. One morning, Mary approached the river with a new idea. He had noticed how fish tended to gather in certain channels during low tide, and he experimented with crude traps fashioned from reeds and mud. The design was simple, yet effective, allowing the villagers to catch more fish without venturing into dangerous waters. Children watched in awe as the nets filled, their laughter echoing across the banks of the Nile. Yet even in this triumph, the shadow of uncertainty loomed, one miscalculation, one unexpected flood, and the traps would be lost, the harvest ruined. This fragile balance kept every day tinged with suspense, every success tempered by the awareness of how easily it could be undone. Mary's innovations were not limited to survival, they extended into crafting tools that reshaped daily life. Stone knives became more precise, clay pots more durable, and simple plows allowed for deeper, more efficient tilling of soil. Each advancement was a small victory, a testament to the ingenuity born from necessity. Yet these inventions also carried unseen consequences. The more efficient their tools became, the more they could strain the land or disrupt established routines, creating new challenges even as they solved old ones. It was a delicate dance between progress and risk. The emotional dimension of invention was as significant as the practical. Villagers took pride in their creations, celebrating small successes as communal victories. A set would smile as she watched her children play with improvised toys carved from scrap wood, marveling at how ingenuity could transform even the simplest objects into sources of joy. The craftsman's work instilled hope, offering tangible proof that human effort could bend nature to serve life rather than destroy it. Yet, alongside hope, there was always an undercurrent of anxiety. Each experiment was a gamble, a failed attempt could have severe consequences, from spoiled crops to wasted resources, or even injury. This inventive spirit extended to medicine and survival techniques as well. Herbs were combined into potent remedies, boiling water was used to purify grains, and simple bandages were applied to wounds to prevent infection. Knowledge of the natural world became intertwined with survival, and every observation counted. The healer, who once moved cautiously through the village treating the sick, relied on villagers' ingenuity to reinforce his efforts. Innovations in food storage and water management directly impacted health outcomes, reducing the spread of disease and helping families like ascets endure despite relentless challenges. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the village, Mary unveiled his latest innovation, a storage silo that could protect grain from floods and pests. It was an elegant solution, combining knowledge of construction with a deep understanding of nature's patterns. Villagers gathered, murmuring in admiration, aware that this could mark a turning point in their survival. Yet even as they celebrated, a sense of tension lingered. The Nile had always been unpredictable, and past seasons had shown that no innovation was foolproof. The promise of prosperity was always accompanied by the threat of calamity, keeping the village in a perpetual state of cautious anticipation. The creativity of the ancient Egyptians was also reflected in social collaboration. Sharing techniques, pooling resources, and collective problem-solving became central to life along the Nile. Children were taught to observe, imitate, and experiment from an early age, ensuring that knowledge was passed down with both precision and care. In every home, the boundary between survival and invention blurred. Cooking, crafting, and farming were all arenas where life could be improved through thought, observation, and skill. Even in moments of success, the tension never fully dissipated. A sudden flood, a predator, or a spoiled batch of grain could unravel days of careful work. Yet it was precisely this precariousness that fueled innovation. Every problem demanded a solution, every challenge a creative response. In this way, the ancient Egyptians demonstrated a remarkable resilience, shaping a world in which human ingenuity and the forces of nature were locked in a constant, suspenseful dance. By the close of the day, as families gathered for their modest evening meals, the viewer is left with a haunting realization: survival was never guaranteed, but human creativity had carved a fragile sanctuary against the relentless forces of nature. Each innovation, each small triumph, was a testament to the enduring human spirit, a spirit that would resonate across millennia. The section ends with a lingering question: what other secrets lay hidden, waiting for the next generation of observers to discover and reshape life along the Nile once more? Life along the Nile was not shaped solely by the river, crops, or tools, it was equally defined by human relationships. Bonds of family, friendship, and trust created the invisible networks that allowed survival, yet these same bonds could be fragile, strained by scarcity, fear, and ambition. In a world where every day demanded vigilance, even small conflicts could escalate into life-altering consequences. The village was a delicate ecosystem, and the social fabric was as vital to survival as fertile soil or flowing water. In the morning light, the village stirred with activity. Children ran barefoot between mud-brick homes, women carried water in clay pots, and men set out to tend fields and animals. Beneath this daily rhythm, tension simmered. Land disputes, competition for fishing spots, and disagreements over food storage were common. Villagers had to navigate these disputes carefully. Alliances could mean protection and shared resources, while broken trust could mean isolation or even danger. Every interaction was measured, every smile and gesture weighed for meaning. At the center of one such tension was a farmer named Hapu. His fields were fertile, yielding grain that his family relied upon, but neighboring families accused him of diverting river water unfairly. Rumors swirled, whispered behind reed fences, that Hapu had stolen from others to secure his own survival. The village council of elders convened, a solemn assembly where disputes were aired and judgments rendered. These moments were fraught with suspense, the air thick with anticipation as everyone awaited the verdict. Hapu's future, and by extension, the survival of his family, hung in the balance. Meanwhile, families like Asset's had to navigate subtler conflicts, shaped by fear and scarcity rather than overt accusation. When food was limited, even close neighbors became competitors. Sharing grain or water could strengthen bonds, but overextend generosity, and a family might find itself vulnerable. Every decision carried weight, every choice could shift the balance between communal harmony and isolation. The stakes were not abstract, they were a matter of life and death. A small act of betrayal or misjudgment could ripple outward, affecting everyone in the community. Yet social bonds were not solely defined by conflict. Marriage, friendship, and mentorship created layers of interdependence that strengthened the village. Children were raised collectively, taught by mothers, grandmothers, and older siblings, learning not only practical skills but also the unwritten rules of social survival. Elders shared stories and traditions, imparting wisdom about the river, the seasons, and the consequences of human behavior. These relationships were as crucial to survival as food and water, teaching cooperation, empathy, and resilience in the face of uncertainty. Even within families, dynamics were complex. Asset's children observed both the warmth and the tension of adult interactions. Her oldest, a boy named Pasair, witnessed disagreements over water and food and began to understand the subtle negotiations that defined social life. He learned to mediate, to balance compassion with practicality, and to anticipate the needs and moods of others. In this way, the next generation was already being molded by the pressures of survival, equipped with both emotional intelligence and practical skills necessary to navigate a precarious world. Conflict could escalate rapidly. A minor disagreement over grazing land might spark a feud that lasted seasons. Alliances shifted, grudges persisted, and the line between survival and disaster was thin. Villagers often resorted to clever negotiation, strategic withholding of information, or even sabotage to protect their interests. Human ingenuity was not limited to tools and farming, it extended to social strategy, alliances, and manipulation. Every conversation carried layers of meaning, and every decision was a test of judgment. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky blazed with orange and crimson, a confrontation erupted between two neighboring families over a newly built fish trap. Words were exchanged, threats made, and the village watched in tense silence. The river, usually a symbol of sustenance, became a metaphorical battlefield. Could the elders intervene before violence erupted? Would trust survive, or would fear and selfishness fracture the community? The suspense hung thick in the air, a reminder that human relationships could be as dangerous as floods or famine. Despite these tensions, the villagers demonstrated remarkable resilience. Shared rituals, communal feasts, and collaborative work in fields and along the river strengthened bonds. Even amid disputes, people recognized the necessity of cooperation for survival. When disease struck, or when food ran low, villagers pooled resources and knowledge, mitigating the threats that none could face alone. These alliances, delicate as they were, became lifelines, emotional and practical support systems that allowed humans to endure the constant pressures of life along the Nile. The social dynamics also influenced personal identity and reputation. Villagers understood that behavior had consequences beyond the immediate moment. A kind act might build alliances that proved essential in future crises, a selfish move could isolate a family, leaving them vulnerable to hunger, illness, or conflict. Children learned these lessons early, observing the successes and failures of adults. Through careful attention, they developed an intuitive understanding of social strategy, a survival skill as critical as farming or fishing. By nightfall, the village was quiet, but the tensions lingered like shadows. Hapu's fields remained a point of contention, Aset's family worried about the distribution of grain, and the larger community sensed the fragile balance of alliances. The river's murmur seemed to echo the unspoken anxieties of the day. As families settled into their homes, the audience is left with a profound understanding. Survival in ancient Egypt was not merely a battle against the natural world, it was also a continuous negotiation with the human one. Every choice, every action, had consequences that rippled across the social fabric, shaping lives in ways both seen and unseen. The section closes with an unresolved tension. The village survives, but barely. The conflicts, alliances, and subtle betrayals of the day leave viewers questioning: who will endure, who will falter, and how will these delicate social bonds influence the fate of the community in the coming weeks? The suspense sets the stage for the next chapter, where archaeological revelations will illuminate the hidden truths behind these struggles, connecting human stories with the tangible remnants left behind by a civilization 7,000 years in the past. Beneath the scorching sun and the ever-changing waters of the Nile, secrets of the past lay hidden, buried under layers of soil, silt, and centuries of human endeavor. For archaeologists centuries later, these remnants became more than just artifacts. They were whispers from lives long extinguished, keys to understanding how people survived, thrived, and sometimes failed 7,000 years ago. The soil itself seemed to pulse with stories, and every discovery carried the weight of human triumph and tragedy. Excavations in a remote settlement revealed the skeletal remains of a woman, her bones worn thin by malnutrition but showing careful evidence of healed fractures, a silent testament to resilience. Beside her lay rudimentary tools, carefully crafted from flint and bone, hinting at the daily labor that sustained her. Archaeologists could see the rhythms of her life: early mornings tending to crops, hours spent gathering water, and the persistent struggle to feed her children. Each artifact painted a picture of the human experience, giving voice to those who had otherwise vanished from history. In the same dig site, storage pits filled with ancient grain told another story. Some grains bore signs of careful preservation, while others were damaged by insects or floodwaters. These pits revealed a constant tension between ingenuity and vulnerability. Villagers had developed techniques to protect their harvests, yet even the most careful measures could not guarantee survival. Every discovery was a silent narrative of trial and error, hope and disappointment, echoing the daily challenges faced by families like Aset's and Hapu's. A particularly revealing find was a cluster of fishing tools, some worn smooth from years of use, others broken and abandoned. These items suggested a sophisticated understanding of seasonal patterns and animal behavior. The placement of traps, the design of nets, and even the choice of bait reflected an intuitive knowledge passed down through generations. It was easy to imagine Mary, the craftsman, inspecting the traps each morning, adjusting them based on subtle environmental changes, each alteration a potential lifesaver. Yet the very same ingenuity also hinted at the fragility of their world. A sudden flood or shift in fish patterns could render months of work useless, a reminder of the constant gamble between human effort and nature's unpredictability. Buried alongside tools and grains were fragments of pottery, some bearing charred remnants of meals. Chemical analysis would later reveal traces of fish, grains, and wild herbs, offering a glimpse into diet and nutrition. These fragments spoke of adaptation and resourcefulness, showing how villagers maximized the limited resources available to them. Yet they also hinted at scarcity. The presence of certain wild foods suggested that cultivated crops alone were often insufficient. Life along the Nile was a delicate balance, and survival demanded constant vigilance, knowledge, and creativity. Bones told a particularly haunting story. Marks from disease, malnutrition, and injury were etched into skeletons, evidence of the struggles endured in silence. One skeleton, that of a child no older than 7, bore the unmistakable signs of prolonged illness. The juxtaposition of this child's remains with nearby tools and pottery suggested the family had done everything possible to protect him, yet nature and circumstance had been merciless. The emotional weight of these findings was profound. They transformed abstract data into a narrative of human suffering, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of life against overwhelming odds. The placement of graves and remnants also revealed social hierarchies and community structures. Larger dwellings with more elaborate storage facilities suggested families of greater influence, while smaller homes reflected those with limited resources. Yet material wealth did not guarantee safety. Even the most resourceful families faced illness, social conflict, and environmental hazards. Archaeological evidence demonstrated that ingenuity, cooperation, and adaptability were often more critical than status or possessions, a lesson echoed in the daily lives of villagers and the subtle dynamics of trust, loyalty, and rivalry. Perhaps most striking were the subtle clues about human behavior and emotional life. Traces of repaired tools, carefully stored food, and intentional burial practices hinted at foresight, care, and the desire to protect loved ones. These acts reflected more than mere survival, they were expressions of hope, love, and cultural identity. They suggested that even 7,000 years ago, humans understood the importance of legacy and continuity, striving to leave behind evidence of their lives and protect those who came after them. The emotional resonance of these discoveries transformed the past from a static collection of artifacts into a living narrative, a story viewers could emotionally inhabit. One of the most dramatic revelations came from a recently unearthed refuse pit, where layers of discarded shells, bones, and broken tools had accumulated. The stratigraphy of the site revealed patterns of overuse, scarcity, and environmental change. Forensic analysis indicated periods of famine, fluctuations in fish populations, and repeated flooding. It became clear that life along the Nile was a constant negotiation between human resilience and environmental volatility. Villagers had developed ingenious methods to mitigate risks, yet every season brought new uncertainties. This refuse pit, seemingly mundane, became a window into the persistent tension that defined existence 7,000 years ago. Yet archaeology did not only reveal hardship, it uncovered moments of triumph and ingenuity that resonated across millennia. A small, intricately carved figurine suggested ritual or artistic expression, while evidence of advanced irrigation channels demonstrated remarkable problem-solving skills. Villagers had not merely survived, they had adapted, innovated, and left behind traces of culture and intelligence. These discoveries challenged modern assumptions, highlighting a civilization that was dynamic, adaptive, and profoundly human. Every artifact, every skeletal fragment, was a bridge connecting us to people who lived, loved, and struggled in ways that were at once alien and familiar. As the sun set over the modern excavation site, archaeologists brushed away the final layers of sediment from a particularly well-preserved mud brick structure. The bricks themselves told a story of labor, cooperation, and technical skill. Marks of tools and fingerprints were frozen in time, remnants of hands that had toiled for hours under the relentless Egyptian sun. Observing these marks, it was possible to reconstruct not just the physical environment but the emotional landscape of the people who built it, the pride in their work, the exhaustion of daily labor, and the constant awareness of survival's fragility. The suspense for viewers lies in the hidden nature of these discoveries. Every uncovered artifact prompts new questions: who used this tool? What were they thinking, feeling, fearing? How did families like Asset's respond to disease, scarcity, and conflict? Archaeology provides answers, but also raises deeper mysteries, leaving a haunting tension between knowledge and the unknowable past. The audience becomes a participant in the excavation, uncovering stories and piecing together lives from the faintest traces. By the end of this section, viewers are confronted with a profound revelation: the past is far more vivid, complex, and human than textbooks suggest. Life 7,000 years ago was a delicate interplay of ingenuity, resilience, social negotiation, and constant adaptation. Archaeological evidence transforms abstract history into lived experience, allowing us to step into the shoes of those who navigated a world where survival was never guaranteed. Every discovery, every trace, reminds us that human struggle and creativity are timeless, bridging millennia and resonating deeply with the modern observer. The section closes with a cinematic cliffhanger. Beneath the layers of soil and sand, countless secrets remain buried, waiting for future generations to uncover. Some will reveal triumph, others tragedy, but all will carry the unmistakable imprint of human life. The audience is left with a lingering sense of suspense and curiosity. What remains hidden beneath the Nile, and what else could transform our understanding of survival, society, and ingenuity in the ancient world?